Welcome to the Practitioners Rise podcast. I'm your host, Haley Krajewski, marketing strategist, natural health advocate, and a mom on a mission. Each week, I sit down with natural health and wellness practitioners from around the country who are doing incredible, life-changing work. We go deep on the things you've been Googling at midnight, share real tips and resources, and my hope is that you walk away feeling more informed, more empowered, and more confident in the choices you're making for yourself and your family. Because I really believe that when practitioners rise, entire communities rise with them. So let's dive in. Today's guest spent almost 20 years sitting with people in the worst moments of their lives. As coordinator of the Healing Place at Sacred Heart Hospital, she helped families walk through death, divorce, and job loss, any transition that cracks a life open. And she wasn't just doing this professionally, she was also living it. She lost her father to Alzheimer's, her brother to COVID, and today she's the caregiver for her 95-year-old mother. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she found poetry, not as an escape from grief, but as a way through it. So today, Amy Segerstrom is a trained spiritual director, mindfulness teacher, and published poet, currently working on a collection called Stretch Marks. So if you ever grieved quietly because you didn't want to burden anyone or told yourself you should be over it by now, or maybe just never found the words to say what you're carrying, this conversation is for you. So Amy, thank you so much. So grateful that you're here, and I am excited for our conversation today.
I am too, Haley, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Well, usually I like to start with story, and part of the reason that I'm really excited to have you here is because I think so many people are struggling for grief, and it looks so different for everyone. And I know that my family alone has gone through a lot of loss in the past year, losing 3 family members, and I think everyone experiences it differently. So I'm so excited to learn from you today. I think where I want to start out is that in the intro, we talked about you spent almost 2 decades helping people navigate grief professionally, but you were also living it yourself with your father's Alzheimer's and your brother's death from COVID. How did doing that work personally change the way you showed up for people also professionally?
That's a really good question because grief definitely is something that is personal. And it is very different to actually be living grief than to know it up here, to have the degree, the education, and to actually be living it yourself. And I was always mindful of that when I worked with people. I never considered myself to be an expert in grief. I really think people are their own experts in their own experience. I will say that I had the knowledge and information and experiences to lead people through the process of grieving and give them tools and strategies for self-care along the way. So when I was experiencing the loss of my father, which happened actually over a period of 13 years, he had Alzheimer's for a long period of time. And after he passed away, it's almost like a second death when somebody has a lengthy illness like that. First there's the death that happens by inches through the process of Alzheimer's and any disease, where you're losing them bit by bit. And then when they actually physically pass away, there's another layer of that grief that happens. Sometimes people mistakenly believe that if people have gone through a lengthy illness, such as Alzheimer's, that by the time the loved one passes away, they really don't have much grief. And I would say that's not true. I would say that it just is a different sort of grief. So definitely the loss of my father through his illness and then death helped me to approach my clients in a different way. What I realized at that time is how very spiritual the process and sacred the process of death and dying is. And I knew that before, but I knew it in a different way. And after the death of my father, I sought some additional training in spiritual direction through the Franciscan Spirituality Center down on La Crosse, and became a trained spiritual director. And it wasn't true as a counselor. It certainly wasn't true as a spiritual director. I am just providing the space and a safe space, I like to think, for people to do some exploration of the questions that they have. Because there are so many questions that we do have around life, those bigger questions of purpose and meaning when we experience a major loss. And that definitely happened with my dad's death. So the training that I had was really helpful in letting me see the value of listening. I already knew that, but what I learned to do even more so is have a level of comfort in just allowing the space to hold the story and allow the story to unfold. And I really saw myself as a witness, where I was there to witness in a sacred way a story. And something larger than myself would also be present in a room with every person that I met with. And I always felt held by that. And I could feel that I could rest in that and sit back in it and allow the person's story to unfold and know that something larger than myself had me and my words and my questions and responses that would come about. So that was really a comfort to know that that was always with me. Those questions that we have really put us in touch with the beginning of our lives, the end of our lives, and everything in between. And I like, here's where some of the poetry piece comes in. There's a writer named William Stafford who is no longer living, but he wrote a poem called The Way It Is. And it references this thread that we have from birth to death and beyond that is always running through our lives.
Mhm.
And when we experience a loss, we're probably more in touch with that thread than normally we would be. Our lives in our society and our culture are so busy, so crazy busy. And you, as a mom of four, you probably are more in touch with that right now than I am as a retired person. But I remember the craziness of that, Haley. I think when something happens, we don't have a choice because it just knocks us over
Mhm.
and it makes us stop and pause. I like to call it a holy pause because we are not functioning the same when we've had our loss. Our brains are not working. We breathe differently. We tend to breathe from up here. We take very shallow, narrow breaths. And so we're not getting the oxygen in our bodies and our tissues in the same way. We can't think the same. We sometimes can't put two thoughts together or two sentences together. So that's very, very different. To get back to your original question of how did the deaths impact me? Definitely my father's death was probably the one that snowballed me and started me down that path of the spirituality piece. The other death that was very important was the death of my brother. And my brother died 3 years ago. It was a death that was related to COVID. He had COVID around Thanksgiving time. And because he was diabetic, he ended up with something called cellulitis and ended up hospitalized. And from there, he ended up with hospital borne infections, one on top of
Mhm.
another. And so technically, he died from the hospital borne infections. So we were not anticipating his death at that time. So that was a different sort of death. Dad, we were anticipating. John had literally just retired when he was still hospitalized.
Oh my.
And here he was on the verge of living all kinds of wonderful things. He had a son in medical school. And my nephew, one nephew graduated from social work, and the other one was still doing his undergrad. So he had all these things to look forward to. That's a different loss. It's a very different loss to lose, first of all, to lose a sibling versus a father, and then to lose somebody in the prime of their life. We have this sense of justice around death. We don't believe it should happen in certain ways to certain people. And certainly the death of somebody when they're in the prime of life would be one of those ways. We all witnessed that during COVID, where a lot of people ended up dying in a way that we would call premature. When I worked with parents who had lost children, that's what we say is not the natural order of things. We think we're going to outlive, our children are going to outlive us. And in some cases, there are planned for care at a later stage. And when they pass, we no longer have that safety net. So there's a lot of things that happen around loss. We like to think they only happen one at a time. That
Mhm.
isn't true either. I worked with many people who had this cascade of losses that had happened throughout their lives, and even in the moment that they had gone through a loss, one loss on top of another loss, and loss accumulates in our hearts and in our brains, and is sometimes connected to prior losses. So if people have had a past traumatic loss, and then they experience another one, they may find themselves having flashbacks, experiencing some of those prior losses as if they were right here again.
Mm.
And that's a very common thing for that to happen.
There's so much I want to unpack there. I think it first by starting, I know you said, right, there's different kinds of loss. And I'm going to go off script here for a
And
moment.
go where you go.
But I'm going to try not to get emotional too, but different kind of loss. One, like you're expecting maybe that it's going to happen, and then one that's very unexpected. And sometimes when I'm trying to unpack my own grief or thinking about it in a way like, I'm not so much as sad for myself, but sad for the loved ones who lost that person also. And so I don't know if there's something there that's also a part of grief, or is there anything that's coming up for you when I'm asking that?
And what I'm hearing is an observation that you're making. You're noting that you have had that experience and noted that, yeah, is there something in the air? Yes, there is something in the air. And it's vibration, it's energy. And we pick up on when people around us are hurting. Sometimes we know what the story is, and other times we don't, and we can feel it in the air. In the same way that if we were to walk into a room and we feel this positive vibe, this wonderful energy, or the opposite, a negativity that we just want to say, I'm leaving this room. It's our intuition. It's a part of us that our culture doesn't necessarily believe in, but it definitely is there. It's part of the heart. We have Dr. Richard Davidson, who is a researcher in mindfulness from Madison, would call cortical snobbery in our society because we elevate the brain. Unfortunately, we don't know things like our heart has more neurons than the brain, which is kind of an amazing thought. So the heart is like a second brain and the gut is a third brain. So it's not just our brains, our bodies are, in fact, each of our individual cells are their own brain. We used to have this divide between Eastern and Western cultures, and even Eastern and Western medicine, where we have this belief that we're just treating the body, when we treat illness. Now we know better. We know we need to address the whole of a person. We need to address the heart. We need to address the gut. We need to address breath. Everything is impacted. So if you've had that experience of picking up on somebody's emotions, you're human. You're
Mhm.
human, and you're in touch with the fact that you're human and not just walking around as this brain.
Yes,
Oh,
I've been learning so much over this past year. I actually always tease I have this coach who was like a branding and messaging coach, but she did so much more than that and really taught me
mm,
on like energetics and mindset and like even just on the business side of things, how much that personally like has transformed my life in the last year and just being aware
mm,
of the energetics and the mindset. And so I know that's part of what you do. How do you incorporate
mm.
that mindfulness the energy into what you do when you work with people who are experiencing grief?
Mm, that is a really good question. And in addition to the spiritual direction training, mindfulness was a huge part of what I taught and got into with my clients, because what I noticed is when people were grieving so often, it was like that layer of loss was right here in front of their face. And it didn't matter when the loss had happened. If it was an early loss, especially, it was more likely to impact every moment they were in. Even if there were other things happening in their lives at that moment, they were more in touch with that layer of grief. So I realized that there was something more going on in terms of our presence. And when what it is, it's the mindfulness piece. When we're grieving any type of grief, we're more likely to only be in touch with that layer of grief and not anything else. I used to tell my clients, I always had a Kleenex box handy. You know, when you're a grief counselor, you got to have this as our tools, and
Yes.
you have to have it there. So I used it, and what I would say is, you know how this box, which is kind of empty now, but you know how they're normally filled up when you first open them up. So there's all these layers of Kleenex in the box, and when somebody was grieving the loss of a loved one, here was the layer of grief. In actuality, it was one layer in in a moment in time, and a layer of reality, let's say. But it felt like the whole box.
Mhm.
And I would never tell somebody it wasn't the whole box, because it was the whole box to them at that time. But it helped to put them back in touch with the fact that there were all these other layers that were still present in their life that they could connect to. So it was grief and my 4 children in the other room. It was grief and somebody sent me some flowers, or grief and I went for a walk and I'm hearing the birds singing. It's not a grief or, it's a grief and. It's always the end. I always call it the end of life, A and D, because we have both those things at play. And we don't ever want to leave grief alone as this one little layer. We always want it held by all the other layers. So even when this layer is the one that's prominent, if we can add some of the other layers, we feel supported and we don't feel so alone, because part of the pain of grief is that loneliness. We maybe can't change the emotion of grief itself, or the intensity of the emotion, but what we can do is make sure we feel held. When David and Francine Wheeler, you're building love around your heart, around that hole, and you're adding other things to it. So it's not a process of subtraction, even though loss feels like a subtraction, because it is the actual physical loss of that person. But spiritually, we are never disconnected from anybody that we love. So grief is partly that transition from the physical death to the spiritual life that still remains. Over time, with both my dad and my brother, for example, I learned to connect to them spiritually. And in some ways, they are more present for me. I connect with them daily. It's not something I do intentionally. It just happens. My dad was a very funny man. He looked a lot, I don't know if you know who Dick Van Dyke is. He was a very funny man. My dad looked a lot like Dick Van Dyke. He acted a lot like Dick Van Dyke. He was 6'4", very handsome Norsky. Even when he was going through Alzheimer's, he would mug the space sometimes, and you knew he was doing this character that he called Maynard Genderson from Aliba, who would show up at our house when life was getting kind of tense or my mother was irritated. There was Maynard to make things light again, and we might all be laughing. My mom might still grumble a little bit, but he was there to just kind of lighten the mood. And even when he had Alzheimer's, he would just mug that silly face sometimes, and we knew that Maynard was present. So
So,
Haley, I've lost track of our original question.
well, that's okay. This is all great. If someone is experiencing grief, and they've never really practiced mindfulness or even connecting spiritually.
Yeah.
Can you maybe go
Mm.
a little bit into how would someone even start?
I'm glad you brought me back around. My definition of mindfulness is to pay attention with intention.
I like that.
And the attention piece is being aware of our senses in the moment. What am I seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, feeling, hearing in this moment? That's all here. Those are those additional layers. And the intention piece is to hold all those layers with great love and without judgment. So that is a really important piece of mindfulness. If our heart is in a place where we're angry, and we sometimes are very angry when we've lost a loved one to grief and loss. And I'm not going to tell somebody to get rid of the feeling of anger. Pay attention to it. It's a messenger that's here. It's a sacred messenger. Emotions are. And they're meant to be listened to. They're meant to be heard, and they're meant to be held like a child on our lap. I don't mean that they're immature. I just mean that I think we're more comfortable holding kids on our lap than adults. You know, but look to imagine that grief, whatever way it shows up, if there's anger there, if there's resentment, if there's hurt, all those things are often part of grief. To invite them into our lap and say, tell me what you're needing me to hear. What is your story? What is it that you would say to people if you could and you knew they were listening? Because so often grieving people don't get that opportunity. People go and people are trying to do their best. They're trying to be supportive and helpful, but we go into fixer mode. We're great at giving grieving people advice. You just need to do blah, 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 you know? My mother did this and my dad did this. I lost my dog and that's like losing a child. Nope. We're trying to be helpful. The intention is helpful. And to remember it's the intention, but it's really hard to do that when you're in reactive mode and you just have that knee jerk reaction. So, when you're not in that knee jerk reactive mode of grief, to have habits and practices around listening to the grief, that might mean having a daily grief habit. And it would be a practice of mindfulness, of discovery. It doesn't even have to be that long, 5 to 10 minutes, where you sit with your heart and you ask it that question. That image of inviting it up into your lap is one you can sit with. Images are great for transformation. We connect to image, it connects directly to emotion. If that image doesn't work for somebody, to have them ask themselves, what image does work for me? Butterfly, an elephant, I mean, an eagle. People have all kinds of images, an angel that come to them in that moment. Sometimes the voice of the loved one becomes their spiritual director, and they invite that person into that space. Listen to your heart, your intuition. So invite it in, provide yourself the time to sit and listen to whatever is said. That might mean just listening with our ears and our heart. It might mean having a journal in front of us and letting hand go across the page with pen or pencil or at the computer, although there is a different thing that happens in the brain when we use a pen and paper versus typing. So the more modes and modalities you get involved in that, the more hardwired that healing becomes. So something I loved to do with people was art and drawing and painting. And I'm not talking art with a capital A, where you're doing art with the intention of having your own art show someday or something. Art that's healing may be very messy and it may not look like anything when it's done. It may just, finger painting is a great thing to do. I used to work with emotionally disturbed children. And one of the things they loved to do, and this was actually really healing, was we had some mirrors, huge mirrors that we would lay out as a table, put shaving cream on them, and let them go to town. And they absolutely they got so into it and they loved it. It was very tactile and very healing for them. They would calm right down from the feel of that shaving cream. It's very messy. We always had a tarp down, when we used it. And I would highly recommend having a tarp down when you do this, whether you're an adult or a child. If you're like me, I'm extremely messy. So my mother actually got me a bib when I was 35. So I can't even be insulted by that, Haley, because
I love it.
painting too, to have watercolors. I mean, we forget about those things when we become adults, how much we just enjoyed puttering in the art supplies. And if we come up with something that we want to share with somebody, great, but this is just for us.
Mhm.
And it hopefully feels very good, as long as we don't let our ego get involved and think we need to come up with something in particular, but just do it for the play of it and the discovery and the fun of it. And yeah, it's a wonderful practice to do. So other practices around discovery, the poetry, would be one. I so often used poetry in my groups, and I would have people say to me, "That's me. That is me right there. That's exactly how I feel." And some people would relate to some poems, some people would relate to others. Writing of poetry, even if you've never done it in the past, here again, not talking about having a work that you need to have your teacher put a red mark on or anything, which is a shame that that's sometimes the only experience that we have with poetry has not been a positive one, but it connects directly to our heart. And it really is a process of both revelation and revolution. And I say revolution or revelation because it is that process of discovery. We have those aha moments when we're both reading and writing poetry. Those moments of discovery, we have no idea what's going to come up, like you and I right now when we're talking. I think the fun part is really the discovery piece
Mhm.
where we both are kind of learning something maybe we didn't know. So that's the revelation piece, that light bulb moment that we have. And the revolution piece is how it changes our behavior. Because now that we have this insight, we can't possibly be the same person anymore. So, with any insight from moment to moment, with even just breath happening, being aware of it, we now become changed by that breath. With mindfulness, breath becomes something very different. We take, I can't even remember, some crazy amount, like I want to say 60,000 breaths a day. And I might be getting breaths and the number of thoughts we have mixed up here.
It's
So,
both
so
a lot.
when we use breath for mindfulness and for healing, we're very intentional around the breathing. So we might do a counting technique of some kind, or we might just decide, I'm going to take a couple minutes and breathe in and out, and I'm going to pay attention to how I'm breathing. Am I breathing from up here? A lot of people sigh when they're grieving because they're not breathing. And that's a sign, when they start sighing and you notice it, maybe even model breathing deeper, and they may automatically start to mirror that breath if you're doing that when you're sitting with them. So people are very much up here. What that does is it becomes diaphragmatic breathing. It increases the amount of oxygen we take in by about 30%. So can you imagine how our brains are not working if we're taking in 30% oxygen when we're grieving the loss of somebody? Something that simple. It also puts us in touch with our spirituality. And I love what the Hindus say about breath. They refer to a mindful breath as the breath behind the breath, or they refer to their connection with something larger than themselves, which we may call God or we just may call breath. People have different names for that which is larger than ourselves, but we all are in touch with it.
Yeah.
So breath is another thing, movement. We are creatures that are embodied. We forget that too. We're so in our heads. We forget that our bodies are connected to our heads
Mhm.
and we are meant to be that way. And movement is something that releases stressors, energies. that need to be released. We get our fluids going again, and we are creatures of rhythm. And music, when I became a therapist, that was part of my appreciation of poetry, was to learn that that was something we were actually born to do, is to connect with rhythm. Drumming, for example, in other cultures, they're more likely to do drumming. We don't necessarily do that, but when we hear it, when we hear a beat or a rhythm that we like, there are some that are going to speed up or slow down our heart. There are some that are going to get our hips and our body moving. I'm Norwegian, so not so much, but I'm learning. I'm learning. But some cultures are just better at it than others because they have more experience with it. So music is another thing. Poetry really is a form of music because it has rhythm, it has beat, it has musicality, it has that assonance and consonance where sometimes the words sound alike. There's more to it than just the words and the meaning. There's that rhythm to it. So we sometimes get so busy looking for the meaning, we forget to experience the poem as a mode of rhythm. And in grief, that is really important to do that.
Even in grief, like what you said about poems, sometimes we're so busy to stop and experience it and to really feel it. And so as you kind of had mentioned, all of these ways to cope with it, but whether it's through music or journaling or
Mhm.
breathing or art
Yeah.
or poetry, right? These are all ways that, like you said, you don't have to take an hour or 2 hours out of your day. It can be simple 2 minutes of just focusing on your breath or
Right.
taking, time in the morning to journal or do poetry. I think for me, when I first started, and maybe this could be, a question that some of the listeners have, is I was always like, I don't know what to write. I don't know. I don't even know where to start. Right. So what I
Yeah.
simply started with, and now I do remember, it, is just writing down what I'm grateful for. And then that prompts a lot of,
Mm.
but I think just having something to be prompted with of like, okay, where can I start might be helpful. So I don't know if you have
Yes.
trick or something that you use, whether it's
Mhm.
poetry or art or
Yeah.
journal, like where do people start?
With poetry, you can often find a phrase, a line, a word, an image that you can build on. It's like a jumping off place, like your jumping off place that you mentioned, what I'm grateful for. Gratitude is such a healthy state to be in. And when you're grieving, you don't necessarily feel grateful because you're hurting. And that's might be the last feeling that you have. But what I'm talking about is gratitude as a practice. That's a really different thing. You may or may not feel grateful, but to have a practice around gratitude, that means naming those small things that we notice that make up our present moment. That just means looking around and seeing. It might be the simplest thing. I'm grateful for this water bottle,
Right.
to know what you're grateful for. I mean, we have so much to be grateful for. And when people do gratitude practices, what something I encourage them to do is to try to find things that you haven't written down before.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can't identify those things, but even there's been research done on gratitude practices and what happens with our inflammation in our body. And it reduces the inflammation in our body, which, inflammation is related to so many disease processes. It helps with our emotions. It helps with disease process. Even naming 3 things a day, 3 things. That's not that much. And writing it out again, you're absolutely right. That helps. And to get into that practice, that's what I would call a list poem. You can actually start a list and add onto it every single day. And it's kind of fun and as well as helpful to go back and reread the list. And remember,
Right.
it really is a habit. So even though you don't feel the gratefulness, you may have habits around gratefulness. And what happens for most people over time If you start to habitually do gratitude, you will start to feel gratefulness at some point. And I would highly recommend it. I'm so glad that you remembered that one because that's a really biggie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just ordered some journals for my kids, but they're very young, so we're gonna see how this goes. But we're gonna practice.
Yeah. Well, hey,
We're
that's a good
grateful
time to
for
get into those habits, right?
well, see, you tried last summer and they were a little bit too young. So I'm like, we're gonna bring it back this summer and we're gonna see how it works. But you never know. It's always like a better picture in my mind than actually what happens.
Sure.
So I want to come back to the poetry and talk about your work. But before I do, I have a friend who her husband had a long-term illness and he passed away. And it was really, really just tragic and hard for her. And I just spoke with her the other day. I haven't spoke with her in, probably 6 months other than just checking in. But some of the things that people have said to her of like, you should just do this, or you need to find another man and you need to like, why are you still wearing your wedding ring? Or
Oh, Lordy.
I was appalled by the things I was hearing. And I'm sure you hear that a lot too, of like just the crazy things that people say to someone grieving.
Yes. Oh.
I wanted to bring that up because I think,
Mm.
sometimes we try so hard to fix the problem for other people that maybe ends up making it worse. So, do you have any advice or insight or thoughts around that?
When in doubt, zip the lip.
Mouth was wide open, like people are actually saying these things.
And I know it's yes, they do say, and again, they do it with good intentions.
Right.
We are so much more comfortable as fixers than healers. And offering people observations, like, "Oh, you're still wearing your wedding ring?" Yeah, I'm still wearing my wedding ring. I'm still connected to this person.
Yeah.
All the things you just mentioned that your friend may be doing are so normal, so very normal. And it's really hard to hear those things because what we get is messages that you're doing it wrong. And when we're in such a tender, vulnerable place already, it doesn't take much to scratch at that wound. Maybe when we're not grieving, we can hear something like that from somebody and let them know how we feel about that statement. But when we're grieving, it's harder to do. We just don't have the emotional reserves to do that. So as much as possible, you try to support the intention. If you can, you say, well, I hear that. I hear you're carrying right now. I feel your love, and in your hug right now. And then maybe you want to add an and I want to wear my wedding ring right now. It's actually a normal thing for people to do that. If you don't have the reserves for that and you find you can identify who those people are that may be really hurting when they mean to be helping, it's okay to draw this circle around your life right now and just keep those people on the outside of the circle as much as possible. And the only people you let inside the circle are people that you can say whatever you need to say, and they're just going to be there as witnesses. They're going to be there to support you, to reflect back that they heard you. They're going to give you a hug. They're probably not saying a whole lot. They're probably doing a whole lot more listening than talking. It's if you hear the phrase circle the wagons, we circle the wagons around ourselves, and it's going to be just ourselves and our family. And when I say family, I don't necessarily mean biological family. Family for me is anybody who can hold your heart safely. It may be friends that you've had in your life. It may be somebody you went to college with you haven't talked to for 20 years. And all of a sudden you're back in conversation with them. People are often hurt by family and close friends when they have expectations of how they will show up and it looks different. And I can guarantee you it's going to look different
Mhm.
because we really can't predict how somebody's going to show up. You may have expected, for example, that somebody that you're very close to is the one who's going to be there anytime you need to call them, and find that they're the ones having the toughest time because maybe they loved that person too and they also love you. People get disappointed in their spiritual leaders. I thought Pastor so and so would be calling, or this person from church would show up, and it's not happening. Or when they do, they say, well, God just needed a rose for his for his garden, and that's why they took your loved one. Not helpful. Not helpful at all. And yet they would have been taught to say that. And there may be some people that are comforted by that, but I've never met them. They would not have shown up in my office. So let me put it that way. So yeah, it's really hard to know who can be there. Simple things are what people need. Just, the hug, even saying, I don't know what to say. I'm at a loss for what you're needing. People will say, just give me a call if you're needing something. And it's highly unlikely that they will.
Yeah.
And so to know that I want to probably reach out for somebody, and maybe I want to do it in a way that's very unobtrusive, a text message. Hey, just thinking about you. Is there a time you would like to talk? Or, just something to let them know that you're thinking about them. But they may not. They may want to just have some peace and quiet, and they're going to be exhausted. I read somewhere that people who are grieving need 6 naps a day.
Wow.
And I don't know anybody who actually has the luxury of 6 naps a day. So obviously they're not getting the sleep that they need when they've had a major loss. But I think that just illustrates the intensity and the amount of energy that it takes to grieve. It takes a lot.
Do you think right now there's a lack of support around grief? I mean, like we had talked about maybe even before we hit record, but everyone's so busy and we're just constantly moving 100 miles a minute. And often we have to be looking out for everyone else around us. And so some
Mhm.
people may feel like, I don't even have time to grieve, right?
Right.
What are your thoughts around that? Or do you feel like there's a lack of support?
Yes, I would totally agree with that. We do not allow the bereaved very much time. They're given 3 days for a funeral and you're back on. If you're lucky, you work for a company, or you work for yourself where you can make arrangements to have your duties taken care of. That doesn't happen for very many people. So yes, there's definitely a loss. And I think a lot of people have really good intentions. They want to be there. But like you said, they are feeling themselves pulled in so many directions. They feel like they're giving crumbs to people because they themselves are so very busy. And that is something, that's the mindfulness piece for ourselves and the self-care piece, even if we're not in a place of grief, to know that maybe we want to reevaluate our lives. If we don't have time to be there for the people that we love in the ways that we want to show up, are there some ways I can make changes to my life so that I can make that more of a priority? There are different stages of life where it is definitely easier to do that. Somebody like yourself is in the midst of the go, go, go. I mean, the gun goes off in the morning, it's cool, you're gone. And I remember those days, and I have the luxury of being retired now and kind of picking and choosing the projects that I want to be involved with. So it's definitely easier to be there for people, but it doesn't have to be anything huge. It can be just a text. And if you have somebody that's had a loss and you know that you want to connect with them, just put a little note on your computer or somewhere where you can see it that say, hey, I want to text so and so today, and just let them know I'm thinking of them. Keep a collection of favorite quotes or images that you think would lift somebody up, ones that are heartfelt and have genuinely touched you. And maybe when you think, hey, I think so and so would get a lift from this today. So we
Nice.
just over to a Redditor house every week. And that is something that has become what something we give to other people. I make the jam, he makes the sourdough,
That's
and
amazing.
together we deliver that often to people that have had a loss. And it isn't going to fix it. It isn't going to change it, but we know that they're not having the energy to cook and think about meals and things when they have had a loss. So it's just something that we often think it has to be something huge. It doesn't. It's
Mhm.
the little things really that matter the most. That
Yes,
really is true.
definitely. And because I want to make sure we have time for this before we end, but we've been talking in the beginning a lot about poetry. And so you have
Mhm.
an upcoming collection called Stretch Marks. And it's about the stretches of the heart, family, grief, appreciation of the natural world, and opening up to people different from ourselves.
Mm.
Can you tell me more about the title? What do you hope people feel or learn when they read it?
Well, the title stretch marks, I didn't have in mind when I actually started this collection. When COVID happened, I started writing poetry on a daily basis. And I've always written poetry, that it wasn't anything new, but I made a commitment to it that I was going to do this on a daily basis. Now, it didn't happen every day, always, but I would say it would probably happen 4, maybe 5 days a week that I would actually crank out a poem. Most of it was not that great, but I was able over a period of time to pull out enough that I felt, hey, I think I could put this into a collection. And my goal was I always wanted to have a book of poems, and I knew that I would regret not having that. It's more for myself, but I also love sharing with other people and encouraging them to do the same. And I wanted to leave something for my daughters, who are both adults now, and my granddaughter and grandson. So I pulled together these poems, and when I looked at them, the common thread that I could see was they fell into 4 primary areas. There was the stretches around the dance that we do with family. And then there were stretches around what I called rooted to ripened. And those were the stretches around being mindful of nature
Mm.
and recognizing the beauty of nature and how important that was to myself. And then we had Opening the Heart to Heaven's Gate, which were poems about opening the heart and also poems of grief and loss after the death of my brother in particular, and also around the aging of my mother and being the caregiver for her. And the last section were poems I would characterize as poems of social justice, where I could see as we became more and more interconnected with the rest of the world that it was good to have an awareness of how our own actions were affecting other parts of the world. And so I call that section Indra's Net, which is based on the idea, and I think this was a Hindu idea, of a net that had jewels at every point that the threads came together. And it illustrated the fact that we were all interconnected. We were all part of this huge web of life and this huge cloth. And I loved that particular image. So I like to think if people read those poems, that their heart will stretch beyond their own world, their own communities, into becoming a citizen of the planet. So that was kind of what I had in mind. There's a local artist named Mindy Huntress who has some beautiful, really unique artwork. And I saw a painting that she had done at Vino Cappuccino a couple years ago. She had them on display. And it was a painting of a giraffe. So they're kind of cartoonish looking, and they're very cute. The giraffe had its feet on the planet Earth, and it had this long neck stretching out into the heavens, and it had a flower in its mouth and these huge, beautiful eyes. And I just thought, stretch marks. This giraffe was stretching, and I thought that's what I wanted to do, is to create stretch marks around the heart. So that was kind of my hope and initial thought around that.
That's so beautiful. Well, I know in the show notes we'll include all of your links so people can find it when it's ready
Sure.
to be released. So I have two more questions I want to ask you. Number
Sure.
one, what's something that no one ever asks you about your work that you wish they would?
People do not necessarily ask what something means, believe it or not. They're more likely to share what it means to them. And I feel like in a way a poem is a canvas for that because that's what it's designed to do is to initiate some conversation around what's happening in others' hearts. When you ask the question, about what started the whole stretch marks thing, it's kind of fun to share that story. And it's kind of fun to share the stories around how the poem came into being and what the initial intention was. Because my initial intention rarely is what ends up in the poem. It really is a process of discovery, and there's magic in that process. That's one of the things I love the most is the magic that happens. If that didn't happen, it wouldn't be as much fun. And so to know that there's something larger than yourself at play, you're not going to encounter it until you sit down and the hand goes across the page. I hear your concern earlier. You mentioned, I'm not sure what to even write.
Yeah.
You may not know, but you have something that gets you started. And it may take you 10, 15 minutes to get into it. And you'll go back and you may pull out different lines and say, there's the truth line right there. That's the one that I want to use as the jump off line into something else. And it takes time to do that and give yourself permission to let it evolve that way. We're not designed to know, we're designed to be a vessel that allows that alignment between ourselves and spirit.
I was having actually this conversation. I was going to say earlier this week, but I think it's Wednesday. It was last week. I'm like, the days are all melding together. A new gal that I had met who has gone through a lot of trauma in her life, and her goal is to write a book. And she's like, it's for me first. The
Mm,
process of writing is going to be very healing for me and just getting things on the page. And it might
mhm,
have to be something completely different. So I love that you say that. It's very rarely with what you start with is what it ends up to be.
mhm.
Yes, it's for other people to experience, but it's for you first. And sometimes
Yes.
we forget to put ourselves first.
I think we kind of cringe a little bit when we have that thought of, oh, I'm putting myself first. That's selfish. But the truth is, we are no less important than anybody else on the planet. We're no more important, but we're no less important. We have to have practices around connecting with our own heart and discovering who we are. And in that revelation I mentioned earlier, the discoveries are not around becoming somebody different. It really is just uncovering who we already are. So the poetry, yes, that helps us get in touch with who we are. If it's truthful and it has integrity behind it, I can guarantee you it's going to touch somebody else
Mhm.
because we have so much more in common as humans in our human hearts than we do not. As Maya Angelou would say, we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike, especially in matters of the heart. We may have different experiences, but the heart resonates with anybody's experiences because we have the ability to be compassionate and empathetic.
Yeah.
That's being human. So, yeah, it's absolutely okay and necessary to tell your own truth first and foremost, and then see where this connects to others, or just hand it to others. And likely, if it connects to your heart, it's going to speak to somebody else.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. I think the very last question I want to end on is what do you now know about grief and healing that you could have never learned any other way?
I would say that grief and healing is meant to be your friend.
Mm.
And we don't think of it as a friend, but it comes because we love and we're bound to have that grief and that loss. So I would say when it's there, open the door and let it in. It's there to help you. And if we can learn that it's not our enemy and invite it in, I think we're going to heal so much faster.
Amy, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here, sharing your story. If people want to find you or connect with you, again, I'll have your links, but what's the best way that they can connect with you?
I am on Facebook. I am on Instagram. Email is also okay. My email is just simply all lowercase, my name, no space in between at gmail.com. So Amy Segerstrom at gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from people. So yeah, they're welcome to reach out if there's some question they have or something I can help them with.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you again for being here. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too. Thank you.
Thanks for being here today. I hope this episode gave you something you needed, whether that's a new perspective, a resource to explore, or just the reminder that you're not alone in this journey. And if today's episode spoke to you, tag me on Instagram, share with a friend, leave a review. That's how we build stronger, healthier communities together. One practitioner, one story, one family at a time. So see you next week. And if you're a natural health and wellness practitioner with a story to tell, I'd love to connect. You can find me at practitionersrise.com.